Good morning. We've got a little bit to finish up in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, and then we'll take a look at chapter 4 today and maybe get into chapter 5 where he starts getting into some of the really weightier issues that they're dealing with. Now, just by way of quick review, in chapter 3, we talked about what are the three different descriptions used in chapter 2 and 3. Three different categories of people that Paul talks about. Natural, spiritual, and carnal. We talked about the natural person. Chapter 2, the natural person doesn't understand the things of the gospel or of the cross. The natural man looks at the cross as a foolish message. And we got the spiritual is the contrast. And I think the key here is that the natural person, we're talking about worldview, that they would look at man does not need outside sources of wisdom, that man can think through and kind of understand things just through the natural order of things and does not really believe in divine guidance. Whereas the spiritual person, and of course you get that word from pneuma, spirit and breath are very synonymous in both Hebrew and Greek in the Bible. But this third category, carnal. This is the category that we would put the Corinthians in. They are fleshly, they're carnal, they are worldly. And what is the key characteristic? This person has a spiritual worldview, but why is someone categorized as carnal? What makes the Corinthians in this category? What is the key thing, the key factor that puts them in this category? What is it about them? He says this at the beginning of chapter 3. Why can he not talk to them like spiritual people? They're babes, they're immature. So the key defining characteristic of the carnal person is, though they believe in God, their behavior does not match because they are immature. They are lacking the maturity needed. So that's the category they're dealing with. And then what is the first illustration? He's going to talk about, when we get to chapter 4, how he's applying these things to him and Apollos figuratively. So what's the first figure he uses in chapter 3 to describe him and Apollos? What is Paul doing, and then what does Apollos do as a follow-up? Plant and water. So use this first illustration. Paul and Apollos, we're farmers. We're doing agricultural work. I came and planted because Paul was the first one to bring the gospel there to Corinth. And then he had to leave and go to other places. And Apollos, we know, came after him and watered. He encouraged that work, did more to build up. And then here's where we really finished off last week, is this second illustration, chapter 3, as we look verses 11 through 17. Paul talks about, as a wise master builder, I laid a foundation. And what is the foundation that Paul put down? Jesus Christ, no other foundation. And that's what he said at the beginning of the letter. I desired to know nothing except Christ crucified. I didn't come with cleverness of speech. I didn't come with eloquence, with storytelling, with things like that, or human wisdom. I came and taught to you the gospel, and at its core was the message of the cross, that the world looks at foolishness, or the Jews look at as a stumbling block, but that is the foundation I laid. And then the metaphor that follows, and this is the one, planting and watering, that's pretty straightforward, but he elaborates a bit more on this illustration. What is the true test of a building project? The foundation and structural integrity. So if you put it on the wrong foundation, it's weak to begin with. But even if you build on the right foundation, what if you build with straw and hay? How will that withstand the tests of fire? So he says, be careful with how you build. Don't lay any other foundation but Christ. But then also on top of that, be careful what you're adding to it. A couple of ways you can understand this. It could be talking about the quality of the teaching, whether the doctrine will withstand tests or pressure? Will it hold up under scrutiny? That is possible, but I'm more inclined to think, as he also talked in Ephesians 2, what is the structure he's talking about? And what does he say at the end of this chapter that he's going to come back to a couple of times? What is the structure he's building? What are we really talking about? The temple, that's right. And so in Ephesians, he relates it where, and it's slightly different. This is, I think, more a congregational illustration, whereas Ephesians is more of the universal church, and he includes the apostles as foundations, Jesus the chief cornerstone. So it's not exactly the same in Ephesians, but he says, you are living stones being built up into the household of God. I'm more inclined to think that's what he's talking about here, that the structure and the quality of the work is, did this person give the right teaching? And when people withstand, when their faith holds up over trials, temptation, over false teaching that comes in, when people's faith holds, then it proves the quality of the work, that they laid the right foundation, they taught the right things. That's what I think this illustration is. The structure might come down, and that'll just kind of reveal the quality of that man's work. Robert?
I feel like it's building on what Jesus says about the foundation being his teaching, doing what he says, following, being obedient. Man, why do you come to me and say, Lord, Lord, not do what I said?
Yeah, and so you'll see this. What was taught, is it reflected in how they're behaving? And so it's just, I think that's the simple idea of the metaphor here is he's talking about the kind of work that he and Apollos, they're both building, and it's just a question of what kind of material are they building with. Are they teaching the truth? Are they teaching accurately about Christ? And that's reflected in the way this congregation holds up over time. And not to put it all on the teacher or the builder, because he talks about that. Verse 15, if anyone's work is burned, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet as though through fire. So it isn't entirely on, all Paul could do is plant, all Apollos could do is water, but who causes the growth or increase? There's a certain point where it is left in God's hands. All you can do is plant seeds and encourage the growth, but it's between that person and God as to what the result will be. So I think that's really what Paul is getting at in this chapter here. Let's finish out this paragraph, verses 16 and 17. Here's really where we left off last week. Do you not know that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwells in you? If anyone defiles the temple of God, God will destroy him, for the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. So that's his concluding statement on this metaphor. And why is that such a relevant illustration for them? He does talk about agriculture, but he leans more into this one about the building and the temple. Why? Or these poor workmanship. That could be it. But what do we know about Corinth? A lot of temples there. It's a city. There's agriculture around, but it's not. It's a big city, and it's full of temples. And so when he talks about this, and there's varied translations, I understand, on verse 17. If anyone destroys the temple, mine says defiles. And I think that is probably, there's a subtle difference between if anyone defiles the temple, God will destroy. I think there's a subtle difference there in the Greek between defile and destroy, though I won't say that destroy the temple is wrong. I just think defile gets the right emphasis there. That's what you do when you conquer someone, and it's incredibly offensive. You enter their temple. Very well known in Jewish history when Antiochus Epiphanes, I think about 160 years before Christ, somewhere in there, king of Assyria, when they came in and conquered Jerusalem, they offered pigs in the temple. They defiled it. That was their way of showing we won, rubbing it in. So to go in and defile a temple, it would be just like going and marking something with graffiti. I think that's more the idea of what he's suggesting here is you need to think of yourself and see yourself as the temple, and your behavior, elevating men and all these teachers and all this, you're defiling the temple, which they would understand that to be incredibly offensive. And they just don't realize that's what they're doing spiritually. Gil?
They're at a time where the Judaizing teachers come in. Judaizing teachers have been teaching center of worship at the temple. They had a bunch of temples there. That was where they would go to worship. When they left, they left worship, left religion, they left whatever it was doing.
Yeah.
Now all of a sudden Paul is saying, no, you're building on the foundation of Christ. What you're building is a temple, except you're the temple.
Right.
You're where God's.
And so he's trying to get them to see themselves in a different light. Like we talked about in the very opening sentence here, called as saints. You aren't acting like it, but that's your calling. And so he's trying to get them to realize, even though they are defiled, you need to see yourself as the temple itself. The temple is not a place you go to anymore. Though Gil is right, the Judaizing teachers still emphasize the importance of the temple. It would be destroyed pretty shortly after this. You are the temple itself. That's what he's trying to get them to see, and that's how he's trying to get them to reshape their thinking about the sectarianism.
So that you and you are the temple itself, is that the congregation, or is it individual in the congregation?
In this setting, it can be both, and it is used as both. When we talk about sexual immorality, your body is the temple. And that's more an individual emphasis. And so when you join yourself to a harlot, you are defiling the temple of God with your body. So there is a sense where it is individual, the idea that my body is a temple to the Lord. But in this setting, I think he's emphasizing, this group of Christians here, they represent the temple of God there in Corinth. They are the temple. So I think it's more in a congregational or communal setting in this context, but it can be an individual thing as well to think about, I am a temple of the Lord and God's Spirit dwells within me. So I think both can be true, but in this context it's communal. So he's saying you are defiling the church by your behavior. That would be language that hopefully would be like a splash of cold water in the face or a slap to the face, sort of shocking to their sensibilities. So, do you not know this? And he said, you're babes, you need milk, you should be on solid food. So that's the way he's treating them. Do you not know this? You should know this. You should realize this about yourself, but you don't. You need this reminder again. So that's the language there of the temple. And as he finishes out chapter 3, we really should ignore the chapter divisions. I think especially going from chapter 4 into chapter 5, just ignore the chapter division there. But as we finish out this paragraph here, verses 18 through 23, he circles back to probably the most prevalent theme of these first 4 chapters. The wisdom of God versus the wisdom of the world. The foolishness of man versus the wisdom of God. And it's pretty neat coincidence that things line up here. Let me read this paragraph, and I'll show you where this class is matching up actually perfectly with our Wednesday night study in Job. Let no one deceive himself. If anyone among you seems to be wise in this age, let him become a fool, that he may become wise. For the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God. For it is written, He catches the wise in their craftiness. And again, the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise, that they are futile. Therefore let no one boast in men, for all things are yours. Whether Paul or Apollos or Cephas or the world or life or death, or things present or things to come, all are yours, and you are Christ's, and Christ is God's. So he comes back to this idea of foolishness. Embrace foolishness from a worldly standpoint. But it is God's wisdom that you are pursuing. Become a fool that you may become wise, for the wisdom of this world is foolishness with God, for it is written. Where is this first quote? He catches the wise in their own craftiness. Where does that come from? Who said that, I guess, is more important. It comes from the book of Job. But who said that? If you're in our Wednesday night study, we just talked about this a couple days ago. Who said that? Eliphaz. Isn't that interesting? Because we understand that Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar, that at the end of the book, God rebukes them for saying, they did not speak truthfully about me. That doesn't mean everything they said was wrong. A lot of times they said correct principles, they just misapplied them with Job. And that's where they failed to represent God accurately. So here's a great example of what we're talking about in our Bible study on Job. Eliphaz says something that is absolutely truthful. He just misapplied it to Job, but it's quoted here as this is true. God catches the wise in their own craftiness. Cecil?
There's a perspective difference here of the fool. The fool is talking about here as being aware that it's being foolish. The fool spoken of in Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. The fool there is talking about the person that doesn't think they're foolish.
Right.
When we draw ourselves down in humility and meekness, then in some people's eyes, they may consider that foolishness, but to God, that's the word that leads us to his wisdom.
Yeah, so he's asking them to become fools from a worldly standpoint, from the world's perspective. Embrace the message of the cross, which is all about humbling yourself. That's the point he's trying to make. And Cecil makes a good observation about the fool, especially from the perspective of the Proverbs. The fool is one who rejects instruction, rejects correction, because they think they know it all. They don't need correction. When we get to chapter 4, that's exactly what he's going to accuse the Corinthians of. In a very sarcastic way, in verses 6 through 13 of chapter 4, he's going to say, well, you are full already. You have everything you ever need. You are wise and we are foolish. You are kings and we're scum. Very sarcastic. Sarcasm is a powerful tool that used sparingly can be very effective. And Paul, especially 2 Corinthians, is, I think, a master class on how to effectively use sarcasm to further your point or to emphasize your point. But he's going to make that exact observation. That's a good thing to point out, Cecil, that he's going to accuse them of that very thing, that they think they are wise, that they think they are rich and powerful, and that they don't need anything, but they need to humble themselves. Orrin?
One of the hardest things for male is to be a fool. Very hard for an older man to become a fool, but yet, how many of us took up a sport or a game in our life, playing piano? The moment we sat down, foolish we were, how little we knew.
Yeah.
I think the equivalence here is that you think you're wise, you think you know each other. Here we go. We need to kind of flip that script and understand that you're babes in Christ. We're feeding. And we're moving on to something very deep, very religious, right, in a sense of breakout of the Lord. To move them into a spiritual realm. And you can't do that until you realize, hey, cool, don't know these things. Listen, and at least do this one thing, trust your teacher. Trust.
Music's a good metaphor to relate this to about humility. Why is it so difficult for adults to learn a musical instrument if they've never had any experience with it before? Typically, it's because they want to be playing something that is at a high level and they want to get there quick. Whereas when a child learns an instrument, they're learning how to do chopsticks on the piano, or Mary Had a Little Lamb. And for an adult, that's where you start. But as an adult, you just feel like, well, that's beneath me. I want to start with something a little more advanced. That's why it's often difficult to teach adults who have no musical experience a musical instrument, because they feel like they're already above and beyond that basic level stuff. So that's a good metaphor to tie in. Robert?
I feel like this is also saying, forget what you've learned, because that's not
Right. Well, and they're taking the Corinthian mindset of find your teacher, become their people, sit at their feet, give them all your money. They're taking that worldly wisdom and taking it into the church and behaving like Corinthians instead of behaving like the temple or behaving like the apostles. Yes. Right. And I think there's even some sarcasm in that section of 2 Corinthians. Like I said, 2 Corinthians is the master class on effectively using sarcasm to drive home a point. And so Paul had to learn through trial. It kept him humble, the thorn in the flesh, to keep him from exalting himself. So Paul had to learn these lessons, you might say the hard way, but they're lessons that he values and is trying to get them to understand as well. So, and that's going to be the main point, I think, through the rest of chapter 4, is this challenge to not be arrogant. Because that's what he says here in verse 21. After these two quotes from Job 5 and then from Psalm 94, they basically say the same thing, that the Lord knows the thoughts of the wise and they're futile. The worldly wisdom just doesn't match up to God. Yes, David? Yeah. Well, and I think some people have said that's the measure of a true expert. Is a true expert is smart enough to know all they don't know, but then you get, the Dunning-Kruger effect, where someone just gets a little bit of knowledge on something and then they think they're an expert. But real experts understand their limitations, and I think that's a little bit of what we're getting here as well. So he quotes these two texts, and then he says, the therefore. What do we take away from these texts? Therefore, verse 21, let no one boast in men. That's what he's trying to get them. That's the main point of all of this. Do not boast in men. You're boasting in your teacher. Well, I go all the way back to Jerusalem. I heard from Peter. Well, I was taught by Paul, and he does these powerful miracles. Well, I was taught by Apollos. They're boasting in men, and there's probably other people besides the apostles that they were lining up, false apostles, if you will. So don't boast in men, for all things are yours. What does he mean by that? All things are yours. All their teaching? Yeah, what else? He says, life and death, it's yours. Whether Paul, Apollos, or Cephas, or the world, or life, or death, or things present, or things to come, all are yours. So he emphasizes that twice. What were they doing in Corinth that Paul draws attention to in chapter 1? It's been reported by Chloe's people that some are saying what? There's divisions, and how is it worded there? People are saying, I am of Paul. I belong to Paul. I belong to Peter. This is where he's trying to reverse their thinking. Stop thinking like a Corinthian. Stop thinking like a product of your environment, where you look like, I am sitting at the feet of this master, and I'm their pupil, and I go to their school, and I give them money, and all this, and I belong to them. I am of this school of thought. He says, no. They're servants who serve you. They belong to you. All of what God has done, life and death, the whole planning of God, culminating in the death and resurrection of Jesus, was for you, for your benefit. So stop acting like you belong to someone else. Cecil?
There's two different
Right.
chapter 3, and so it's even natural that men choose devotion to God.
Right. And as I've said before, we're reading parts of a correspondence, and we have to do a little bit of reverse engineering to figure out what was being discussed or what was sent in previous letters and what some of the problems or issues are, because we're only reading part of this correspondence. But the fact that Paul emphasizes money so much, I had to work with my own hands in Corinth. I made a choice, a conscious choice, not to take any money from you. And he'll get into his reasons why. That to me suggests that some of what they're boasting in and why a lot of them were against Paul is money. Is the teachers they would line up were wealthy, successful, had the worldly goods. Paul did not. Paul was constantly getting beaten up, getting thrown in prison, constantly in their mindset begging people for money, working with his own hands. How shameful. And so that tells you that maybe that's some of the things they're boasting in is that worldly appearance. Oren?
Interesting, we start culture or whatever, the lazy man way of thinking. Because all you can say is, oh, so-and-so said that, I agree. Or,
Yeah.
I'm of this camp, therefore we're right. So, drift very quickly from the point he's making, Christ, we belong to him. Here's your ultimate teaching. Everything in the gospel of Christ is going to go back to the Hebrews to prove that he's the Messiah. Anything else is coming from his other disciples, right?
Yeah.
I think it's part of their age that they're in, right? You look at the apostles, like he was the rabbi. This is a very Greek type of thing, how men would group below their teachers. So I think he's cutting this off very quickly. This is how we do. Now, we don't work like the rest of the world. Right?
Yeah.
This is the philosophy that don't adhere to it. It's not Paul, it's not Stephen, it's Christ.
Right. And that's why he's talking about him and Apollos. We don't want you to belong to us. You need to understand, you don't belong to us, we belong to you. And that's where chapter 4, again, it's not a different topic here. There's no division in the original text. This is why it transitions into, let a man so consider us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mystery of God. So he uses a couple of different words there. Servant, if you're reading in the Greek, that is a derivative of the word diakonos. Where have we heard that one before? It's deacon. It's the term deacon. So we are deacons, we are servants, and then steward. What is the idea of stewardship? Yeah, it carries with it the idea of being entrusted with something. Now, in Romans chapter 16, if you go back just a page or two, you'll see this, the same word in the Greek text. Romans chapter 16 and verse, is it 23? Yes. Gaius, my host, and the host of the whole church greets you. Erastus, the treasurer of the city, greets you. And Quartus, a brother. And it's likely that Paul is writing this letter from Corinth. And that word there as a treasurer of the city, it's the same thing as steward. So, and there's actually been a archaeological find, an inscription about Erastus, a city treasurer. Is it the same one? It could just be a common name, so I don't want to get too far off on that tangent. But that's just an example of servants. They have tasks, but treasurer tells you more about this title, that it's you've been entrusted with something of great value, and so they're stewards of what? Mystery of God, the most valuable treasure there is. And so that's his task. You need to see us as we're your servants, and we are stewards of God's immeasurable wealth in revealing the mystery. It's not a mystery anymore because we are revealing it to you. And so the main requirement, what is the main requirement of a steward? Trustworthy. That's what he says in the next verse. It's not about flashiness. It's not about eloquence. It's about being faithful or trustworthy or dependable with the thing that's been entrusted to you. Cecil?
The implication of stewardship relates to, are you using only for yourself or those in need around us?
Right. And that's why he says it's a very small thing in the next verse that I should be judged by you or by human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself. It says it really matters what the master thinks of me. How am I at distributing this? I'm not doing this. I don't take the master's material and use it for my own gain or self-promotion, which is, again, an impression I get about some of these other teachers. Besides Paul or Apollos, I think they are doing this largely for self-promotion. And Paul talks about that in Philippians chapter 1. There are some who preach the gospel for selfish gain. But that's not being a faithful steward. Paul was still grateful that the gospel is still being preached, but they're doing it for the wrong reason and the wrong motive. The main factor here is faithfulness, and who is the only one that can determine the faithfulness of a steward? The master. Paul says, it's a small thing. It doesn't really bother me that much that many of you in Corinth would look at me and evaluate my work and say I'm some sort of failure. Because I don't care what you think of me. He says, I don't even really care too much or put too much stock in what I think of me. Now that can be an important thing, some self-evaluation. But when we're giving a final assessment to God, is it going to be enough to say, well, no, trust me, God, I did good work. I fully approve of what I did in my life. Self-evaluation can be good and useful, but in the final assessment, that's what he says in verse 4 and 5. For I know of nothing against myself, yet I'm not justified by this. He who judges me is the Lord. Therefore judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the hidden things of darkness and reveal the counsels of the hearts. Then each one's praise will come from God. So Paul does self-evaluate, but he says, I know in the final assessment, just because I think I might get a pass or a good grade for what I've done with the mysteries of God and how I've handled my master's possessions, the final assessment is in his hands. So he's trying to get them to be humble. What else did you guys see, or any questions come up in these first 5 verses of chapter 4? Anything else catch your attention here? Yes. Right. Chapter 1 and verse 31, he who glories, let him glory in the Lord, which is, of course, a very famous quote from Jeremiah, one of the most famous passages from that book. And so he's trying to cut out from under them any boasting they might have. And that's going to be a theme that comes up multiple times. Already come up, and it's going to continue to come up. All right, that helps us transition into the next verse. The standard is God, not my own standard, or the way the Corinthians would judge Paul by the world's standards. How does he measure up to the Corinthian teachers? What does he look like when you put him next to them? Does he fit that mold? And none of that really matters. It's the master's standards. So in verse 6, and this is one of those verses that when you start digging into it, because sometimes you notice a certain verse will be very different depending on what translation. Usually from one translation to another in English, most of it's the same, and there's no major differences from one translation to another, just semantics or wording, but some verses you see are more noticeably different. This is one of those verses, and that tells you that it gives translators a bit of a hard time. But look at verse 6. Now these things, brethren, I have figuratively transferred to myself and Apollos for your sake, that you may learn in us not to think beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up on behalf of one against the other. I think no matter what translation, the basic point is still apparent. Paul says, I've been talking about me and Apollos for this reason. The takeaway is that you should be getting from what I've been writing to you is don't be arrogant. Do not be arrogant on behalf of one person against another. Don't elevate man above what standard? What is written? What is written? Do not be arrogant and go beyond what is written. Okay, a lot of questions come up here. First of all, figuratively. Not every Bible says that I've applied these things figuratively to myself and Apollos. How does that change the meaning? If it does not include the idea of figuratively, it says, I've been talking about me and Apollos. You probably are inclined to take this letter at face value that I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos, is what they are literally doing. But if you add in the concept of figuratively, it maybe changes the tone of this letter to they aren't actually lining up behind Paul, Apollos, Peter, or Jesus. He's just figuratively, I'm using us as examples of what you're doing, and they're actually lining up behind these other false apostles. I think both could be true simultaneously, but that's just one note there. That word for figuratively, it carries with it a pretty wide variety of interpretation. Some of the definitions for that word are transfigure or disguise. Or to give figurative meaning to something. So that's why some translations add that word, I've figuratively transferred or applied these things to myself and Apollos. But the other thing here is, what does he mean by not to think beyond what is written? What are some possible understandings of, what does he mean by what is written? What could he mean by that? What written things could he be talking about? Oren, what do you think?
Perhaps a letter that is written, maybe he's trying to get a point in his letter.
Right.
He did spend a year and a half there, right, teaching them, but may have been other in a field, something that is not temporary, something not for man's wisdom. God, so I tend to call it opposite.
Yeah. So those are kind of two thoughts there, is things written, don't go beyond what is written, could be the things that he himself has written. And I'll get to you in just a second, Cecil. Chapter 5 and verse 9, I wrote to you in my epistle. So he said, I already wrote to you about this. Chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians, look at verse 37. If anyone thinks himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him acknowledge that the things which I write to you are the commandments of the Lord. So if he's talking about his own writings, they certainly have a weight of authority to him, but he's really just saying, don't go beyond what God has said through me. So that is one possible interpretation. But I'm with Oren on this. I'll share my reasons in just a moment why I think he's really emphasizing Scripture, and in particular Old Testament Scripture. But Cecil? Yeah, and I do see that he's trying to get them to reshape their thinking about the apostles, and now he's trying to get them to reframe their thinking about themselves here.
So this is where meekness is found its definition.
Yeah.
You're not puffed up, because that makes you other
Yeah.
than yourself.
Let me point a couple things out, Oren, then I'll let you jump in. On this idea of don't go beyond things that are written, Look at just how he's used that word written already in the text. Go back to chapter 1. And you'll notice anytime he quotes from the Old Testament, chapter 1 and verse 19, you get the first of a couple of Isaiah references. Chapter 1, verse 19, "For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise and bring to nothing the understanding of the prudent." Chapter 1, verse 31, already brought up in this class, that as it is written, he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. Chapter 2, verse 9, "As it is written, eye has not seen, nor ear heard, nor has entered the heart of man the things which God has prepared for those who love him." Let's see. And there's one more. Chapter 3 and verse 19. "For it is written," and there's your Job quote, "He catches the wise in their own craftiness." What are all these quotes about, generally speaking? Yeah, going beyond the wisdom of God. The exact same thing he's telling them not to do here. They're all about catching the worldly wise in their craftiness and exposing it as foolishness. It's all these quotes are about being humble before God rather than being arrogant and relying on worldly wisdom. So I can see the fact that all of the quotes Paul has already shared from the Scripture, as it was written, which he emphasizes before almost every quote, are talking about the exact point he's making here about don't be arrogant, don't be puffed up. So I think it could include the writings of Paul, but I think probably what he means more particularly about don't go beyond what is written, the Scriptures he's already shared, written by God. Oren?
Go back to Paul again. His writing. Peter had this to say about Paul and his writing. The implications of our Lord of salvation, just as our brother Paul also wrote to the which was given him, as he does in all his letters, things he's mattered. There are some things in them that are hard to understand. Ignorant, unstable, twist to their own destruction, as they do other scriptures. Interesting to note that Peter, at least I think from this, like your thought on that, is he equating Paul's writing to the scripture, i.e., the true Bible, as equivalent.
Yeah, so there certainly is an authoritative weight to the writings of Paul himself. So I just think this is one of those yes and kind of answers where maybe specifically he's talking about the very passages he's already quoted, but I wouldn't say it's wrong to think that he might also be implying his own writings. He's written them letters before, and his letters carry that authority to him. Stephen?
I don't know if Gnosticism came after this or at this time, but it's just that certain people thought they had knowledge that others did not.
Yeah, I don't think he's specifically addressing Gnosticism, but conceptually, yes, it's that idea, and you're going to see that later on in this letter and in the next, where it seems like he is, you call it the didactic formula, where it's this back and forth, where he's almost filling in what they would be saying, and he says, well, we know this, we know this, we know an idol is nothing, and like he's filling in their wisdom, like they know all these things. And that's the whole idea of the Gnostics, is that they know certain hidden truths. And so, yeah, there's some parallels there, but he's not addressing it as directly as 1 John, for example, but that's not a bad comparison to make here. So don't go beyond what is written. Don't become arrogant and elevate one man above others. Phyllis? Yeah. Have you not read? Yeah, so these are things that have already been established, whether by Paul in his own writings or likely more precisely through the Scripture already given to them. But then he goes on in verse 7 and pushes the matter a little bit further. For who makes you differ from one another? And what do you have that you did not receive? Now, if you did indeed receive it, why do you boast as if you had not received it? A little bit of a tongue twister there, but what's he saying in this verse? What kinds of things did they receive? Teachers. What else? What other things did they receive? Intelligence? The ability to reason and have intellect? God gave it to them. What about spiritual gifts that they boast in that he's going to address later in this letter? Did they just discover those things on their own? How did they get those spiritual gifts? They learned knowledge through the Scriptures, and the apostles gave them those gifts. He's basically saying, like Job in Job chapter 1, verse 21, naked I came into this world, naked I will leave. I brought nothing with me, and I can take nothing when I go. Everything I have was given to me. So why do you act like you always had it? Why do you act like you found it for yourselves? It's all, and that's the great equalizer. It's like that's why you don't elevate one person over another or boast, because we're all on equal footing before God. At the foot of the cross, the ground is level, right? No one comes to Jesus on a higher level. No one comes to Jesus needing less grace than the next person. So we'll finish out chapter 4 next week and read ahead through chapter 4 and then chapter 5, the immorality that has been reported to him.